The last thing I remember of peace was the weight of the book on my chest, its pages soft in the dim lamplight. Sleep had been pulling at me, a gentle tide. The house was quiet, breathing around me with the familiar sighs and settles of old wood. Jennifer was asleep beside me. Down the hall, our daughters Haley and Michaela were in their own rooms, lost in the safe and boundless worlds of their dreams. It was the ordinary, profound stillness of a family at rest. I woke to a pressure, a foreign presence in the room. The air was thick, wrong. Before my eyes could fully adjust to the dark, a blunt, heavy force struck the side of my head. The world dissolved into a smear of flashing lights and a deep, pulsing ache. Consciousness was a slippery thing, a fish writhing in my grasp. I fought to hold it, to understand. There were two of them, silhouettes against the faint light from the hallway. They moved with a practiced, predatory quiet. My mind, still swimming in a fog of pain, struggled to piece it together. Robbery, this had to be a robbery. My thoughts were slow, syrupy. They were talking, their voices low and coarse, a gravelly intrusion into the sanctuary of our bedroom. One of them bound my wrists and ankles with a brutal efficiency. The ropes bit into my skin. They dragged me from the room, my bare feet scraped against the hardwood floor. The pain in my head was a roaring fire, but a colder, sharper fear was beginning to cut through it. Where was Jennifer? Where were the girls? I tried to speak, to ask, but the sound that came out was a choked groan. A hand shoved my head down, forcing my face toward the floor. They took me to the basement. The air grew cool and damp, smelling of earth and stored memories. They threw me down onto the concrete. The impact sent a fresh wave of agony through my skull. They tied me to a support pole, pulling the ropes so tight my circulation began to slow to a painful throb. One of them stood over me for a moment, a vague shape in the gloom. I could feel his gaze on me, cold and empty. Then they went back upstairs. The darkness in the basement was almost total, broken only by a sliver of light under the door at the top of the stairs. But the true darkness was the not knowing. I could hear them up there. Muffled footsteps, the scrape of a chair, the low murmur of their voices, and other sounds. Sounds that my mind refused to assemble into a coherent picture. Was that Michaela crying? Was that Jennifer's voice, tight with a terror I could only imagine? Every creak of the floorboards above was a new torment. My helplessness was a physical weight, crushing my chest, making it hard to draw a breath. I was a doctor. My entire life was dedicated to fixing, to healing, to intervening. And here I was, bound to a pole in my own basement, unable to do anything but listen to the methodical destruction of my world. I strained against the ropes, twisting my wrists until the skin was raw and bleeding. The knots were unyielding, a symbol of my own impotence. I pulled and pulled, my muscles screaming in protest, fueled by a desperate, primal need to get to my family. Time lost all meaning. It was an endless stretch of fear, punctuated by the sounds from above. I tried to focus, to think of a way out. The pole was thick, solid wood. The ropes were new, strong. My head throbbed with a nauseating rhythm. I thought of Jennifer's face, the way she smiled when she was reading. I thought of Haley, so full of life and plans for college, her sharp wit and her fierce love for her sister. I thought of Michaela, my sweet, gentle girl, her passion for cooking, her bright, innocent eyes. They were up there with them. The basement door opened. The sudden light was blinding. One of the men came down the stairs. He did not look at me. He moved around the basement, picking things up, his movements casual, as if he were simply tidying up. He found some old cloths and came back toward me. He stuffed a rag into my mouth, the taste of dust and mold filling my throat. He was so close I could smell the stale sweat on him. I saw his eyes for a moment, and there was nothing in them. No anger, no remorse. Just a flat, dead emptiness. He went back upstairs, leaving the door ajar. The sounds were clearer now. They were talking to Jennifer, forcing her to do something. I could hear the cadence of their commands and her quiet, terrified responses, then a new kind of silence, the sound of the front door opening and closing, a car starting. Where were they taking her? A wild, fragile hope sparked in my chest. Maybe they were just taking her to an ATM. Maybe this was just about money after all. They would get their money and leave. We would be shaken, but we would be alive. We would be together. I clung to that thought like a drowning man to a piece of driftwood. The hope was a lie. I heard the car return. The front door opened again. The house fell into a different kind of quiet, a heavier, more menacing silence. The sliver of hope inside me withered and died. This was not about money. I renewed my efforts on the ropes, ignoring the searing pain in my wrists. Adrenaline surged through me, a chemical scream for action. I twisted my hands, contorting them, feeling the bones grind against each other. One hand slipped just a fraction. It was enough. I pulled again, my entire body shaking with the strain. The rope loosened ever so slightly. I worked at it frantically, my fingers clumsy and numb. A new smell drifted down the stairs. It was acrid, chemical, gasoline. The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow. They were going to burn the house. They were going to erase everything, every trace of us, of what they had done. There was no more time for thought, only for survival. A single, clear imperative cut through the pain and the fear: get out, get help. My hand came free. I fumbled with the knot on my other wrist, my fingers thick and uncooperative. The smell of gasoline was stronger now, a choking vapor that burned my nostrils. I heard them moving upstairs, faster now. I tore at the ropes on my ankles, my nails digging into the tough fibers. They were coming. I could hear footsteps on the stairs. I broke free. I scrambled up, my legs weak and unsteady. I lurched across the basement floor, my body a symphony of pain. There was a small cellar window high on the wall. I threw a wooden crate beneath it and clambered on top. The window was stuck. I slammed my shoulder into it once, twice. The frame splintered. I squeezed through the opening, the broken wood and glass tearing at my skin and clothes. I fell onto the damp grass of my own backyard. The early morning air was cool, clean. I stumbled to my feet and ran. I did not look back. I could not look back. I ran with a single-minded purpose, my bare feet pounding against the pavement. The world was a blur of green lawns and silent houses. I reached my neighbor's house and hammered on the door, my bloody fists leaving streaks on the wood. I yelled, the sound tearing from my raw throat. The door opened. A face, confused, then horrified. I collapsed on his doorstep, the words spilling out of me, a frantic, incoherent plea. Then I saw it, beyond his shoulder, across the lawn that I had mowed just days before, my house. Orange light flickered in the windows of the girls' bedrooms. A thin curl of black smoke was rising from the roof, reaching toward the pale dawn sky. And I knew I was the only one who had made it out. I was alive, and my world was burning. The house had a weight to it, a physical pressure that settled in my bones the moment I walked through the door. It wasn't the wood or the plaster, it was him, my father. Even when he was silent, sitting in his armchair with the television murmuring, his presence filled every room, thick and suffocating like humid summer air. His silence was a judgment. His voice, when it came, was a hammer. That evening was no different. He sat there, a king on a worn throne of vinyl and stuffing, his eyes fixed on the flickering screen but seeing everything. My mother moved around the kitchen, her steps quiet, her motions practiced to avoid making any sound that might draw his attention. My brothers and sisters were shadows, whispers in the upstairs hallways, existing in the spaces he did not currently occupy. I felt their fear, or maybe it was just my own, reflected back at me from the polished wood of the floor. I couldn't stay. The pressure was building behind my eyes, a low hum that had been my companion for weeks. It started as a faint vibration, a thought you could almost swat away. Now it was a constant companion, a second pulse beneath my own. It told me the house was wrong. The noise was wrong, not the sound of the television or my mother in the kitchen, but a deeper noise, the noise of breathing, of existing in his space. I left. The cool night air did little to clear my head. The hum followed me into my car, a resonance in the steering wheel. I drove to the bar, a place of temporary quiet where the drone of strangers' conversations could almost drown out the one in my own mind. I ordered a drink, then another. The amber liquid didn't help. It only seemed to sharpen the edges of the hum, giving it a clearer voice. It wasn't speaking words, not yet. It was an urge, a direction, a solution. The solution was silence, a true, deep silence that the house had never known. I sat there for a long time, watching the faces of the men around me, listening to their meaningless talk. They complained about their wives, their bosses, their lives. They had no idea what real pressure was. They lived in a world of flimsy complaints. My world was made of steel and concrete, a cage built by one man's will. The hum grew louder, insistent. It was time to go back, time to fix the noise. I left my half-finished drink on the bar and walked out into the darkness. The drive home was a blur. The houses slid by, their windows warm yellow squares of imagined peace. My hands were steady on the wheel. My mind was clear, focused on a single point. The house was dark when I returned. All the lights were out except for the small lamp in the entryway my mother always left on. I turned the key in the lock, the mechanism moving with a soft, oiled sound. I stepped inside and the weight was still there, but it was different now. It was a sleeping weight, heavy and unaware. The silence I craved was close. I didn't turn on any more lights. My eyes had adjusted to the gloom, and I knew the layout of this house better than I knew my own thoughts. Every creak of the floorboards was an old friend. I went to the closet where he kept the rifle, a .357 Marlin. It was heavy in my hands, solid and real. The wood of the stock was smooth, the metal cold. I checked the chamber. It was ready. This was the instrument of my quiet. The stairs groaned softly under my feet as I ascended into the deeper darkness of the second floor. The hum in my head was a high, thin wire of sound now, pulling me forward. There was no rage, no anger. There was only a calm, cold purpose, a job to be done. I went to their room first, his room. The door was slightly ajar. I could hear his breathing, a low, guttural rumble that had been the soundtrack to my entire life. It was the source of the noise. I pushed the door open. The moonlight cut a pale slash across the floor, illuminating the foot of the bed. There were two shapes under a blanket. My mother was a smaller, stiller shape beside him. I raised the rifle, my shoulder settled against the stock. The sight found the larger shape in the dark. There was no hesitation, just the task. I squeezed the trigger. The recoil pushed into my shoulder a solid, definitive thump. The low rumble of his breathing stopped. The room was instantly, profoundly quieter. I shifted my aim, another push against my shoulder. The second shape went still. The first part of the job was done. The source of the pressure had been released. I stepped back out into the hallway. The silence was already purer, cleaner, but there were echoes, the smaller noises, the future noises. They had to be quieted too. I moved to the room my two brothers shared, Mark and John Matthew. I pushed their door open. They were asleep in their separate beds, small lumps under covers. They were just boys, but they carried his name. They carried his blood. The hum insisted they were part of the same discordant sound. I did not linger. The rifle came up, a familiar motion now. Two more thumps against my shoulder. Two more sources of noise extinguished. The shell casings landed softly on the carpet. The last room was at the end of the hall. My sisters, Dawn and Allison, their door was closed. I turned the knob slowly. Inside, it was the same scene, two beds, two sleeping forms. Allison was curled on her side, facing the wall. Dawn lay on her back. For a moment, I saw her face in the dim light from the window. It was peaceful, untroubled. A flicker of something, a memory of a shared joke or a childhood game tried to surface. The hum in my head surged, washing it away. They were all part of the house, part of the system he had built. To quiet him, I had to quiet everything that belonged to him. The rifle felt like an extension of my arm. I did what needed to be done. The final two thumps echoed in the small room. And then it was over. Silent. A perfect, unbroken silence. The hum in my head was gone. The pressure behind my eyes had vanished. There was only stillness. The house felt light, empty. It was finally mine. I stood in the hallway, the rifle still warm in my hands, and I listened. There was nothing, no breathing, no rustling of sheets, no muffled coughs. It was the most beautiful sound I had ever heard. The smell of cordite hung in the air, a sharp chemical incense. It was the smell of peace. I went back downstairs, moving with a calm I hadn't felt in years. I placed the rifle back in its spot. I walked through the dark, silent house. I looked into the living room at the empty armchair. It was just a chair now. It held no power. There were things to do, practical things, the next part of the plan. I went to the basement and gathered a few things, my dirty clothes from the day before, the rifle case, the remaining shells. I needed to get rid of them. Then I went back upstairs, careful to step over the shell casings on the floor. I took a shower. The hot water felt good on my skin, washing away the sweat and the tension. I was cleansing myself, preparing for the world outside. The world that would not understand the peace I had created. I dressed in clean clothes. I looked at myself in the mirror. My face was the same. My eyes were clear. There was no monster looking back at me, only a man who had finally found some quiet. I took the bundle of evidence out to my car and drove away from the house. I found a place by the water, a storm drain where the tide would take things away. I threw the items in, watching them disappear into the blackness. One problem solved. Now for the next, I had to go back to the bar. I had to create a different story, a story for them. A story of invasion, of a terrible discovery. It was just acting. I had been acting my whole life, pretending to be a dutiful son. This would be easy. I walked back into the bar. The same men were there, their faces flushed with drink. I let my breath catch in my throat. I widened my eyes. I ran a hand through my hair, making it look wild. I stumbled towards a man I knew, Joey. I grabbed his arm. "You've got to help me," I said, letting my voice shake. "Something's wrong at my house. I think my family's been hurt." He looked at me, his drunken good humor turning to confusion, then concern. Others started to look over. The performance had begun. They gathered around, asking questions I pretended I couldn't answer. I just kept repeating that something was wrong, that someone had hurt them. We all piled into cars and raced back to the silent house. I was leading them to a crime scene, a place of horror, but for me, it was a place of profound, hard-won peace. They would rush in and find the bodies. They would see the chaos. They would see the tragedy. They would never hear the silence. As we pulled up to the curb and the men tumbled out of their cars, I took one last look at my home. It stood dark and still against the pre-dawn sky. It was perfect. It was quiet. It was time to show them what the quiet house held. The dust of our farm was the first thing I knew in the morning and the last thing I tasted at night. It settled on everything, a fine red powder that clung to the windowsills and coated the backs of our necks. That summer the air was thick with it, heavy and still. The sun beat down on the corrugated iron roof, and the heat radiated through the floorboards, making the whole house feel like an oven. Dad Maxwell was a man made of the same earth as the farm. His hands were calloused and cracked, his silence deep and steady like the bedrock beneath the soil. He moved with a purpose that felt ancient, tending to the livestock and the fences as if he were tending to the world itself. Mom Margaret was the opposite. She was the water to his earth, a gentle presence that filled the quiet spaces in our house with the smell of baking bread and the soft hum of a song. She moved through the rooms like a breeze, her touch cool on my forehead. My brother John was just a boy of 8. He was all noise and motion, a whirlwind of scuffed knees and loud questions. He followed me everywhere, a small, persistent shadow that I pretended to find annoying. But in the quiet of our shared room at night, his steady breathing from the other bed was a comfort, a rhythm that anchored me in the dark. That evening was like any other. We ate at the worn kitchen table, the lamp overhead casting a warm, yellow circle of light. Dad spoke little, chewing his food with a slow, deliberate rhythm. Mom asked about our day, her eyes smiling even when her mouth was serious. John chattered on about a lizard he had found, his story growing more elaborate with each telling. I pushed my peas around my plate, listening to the familiar symphony of my family. The scrape of forks on ceramic, the clink of glasses, the low murmur of conversation. Outside, the world was shrinking into twilight, the vast, empty landscape of Croppa Creek surrendering to the dark. After dinner, we sat on the porch. The air was cooling and the sky was a deep, bruised purple filled with a spray of stars so bright they felt close enough to touch. The crickets began their nightly chorus. Dad cleaned his rifle on his lap, the methodical motion of the oil and cloth a familiar ritual. It was not a weapon of violence, but a tool of the farm used for pests and the occasional hunt. He handled it with a respect that I understood even then. It was part of this life, part of this land. Mom brought us glasses of cool water, her hand resting on my shoulder for a moment. John was already nodding off, his head lolling against the porch railing. I felt a profound sense of peace settle over me, a feeling that this moment, this arrangement of people and sounds and smells was immutable, that it would always be this way. Later in our beds, the house settled into its own sleep. The old timbers groaned and creaked, sounds I knew as well as my own heartbeat. John was already lost to dreams, a faint whistle escaping his lips with every breath. I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, tracing the water stains that looked like maps of unknown continents. The only light came from the moon, a pale sliver that filtered through the thin curtains, painting stripes across the floor. That was when I heard it, a sound that did not belong to the night. It was the low rumble of an engine growing closer. It was unusual for anyone to come out this way after dark. Our nearest neighbor was miles away, and the track leading to our farmhouse was little more than a pair of ruts in the dirt. I sat up, listening. The engine cut out, and the silence that followed was heavier than before. Our dog started barking, a frantic, aggressive sound that told me this was not a friend. I heard the scrape of Dad's chair in the main room, then the soft tread of his boots on the floorboards. He was moving toward the front door. I heard Mom's voice, a low, worried question. I slipped out of bed, my feet silent on the cool wood. I crept to my bedroom door, cracking it open just enough to see a sliver of the hallway. The oil lamp in the living room was still lit, casting long, dancing shadows. Dad was at the door, his silhouette a dark, solid shape. "Who's out there?" he called. His voice wasn't angry, just firm, the voice he used with stubborn cattle. There was no answer, only the sound of heavy footsteps on the porch steps. The wood groaned in protest. The front door was not locked. No one locked their doors out here. The door swung open and 2 men stepped inside. They were just shapes at first, black cutouts against the lesser darkness of the night. They were not from around here. They did not have the look of farmers or stockmen. They carried themselves with a different kind of weight, a cold tension that filled the room and sucked the air from my lungs. One was tall and thin, the other shorter, broader. I could not see their faces clearly in the dim light, but I could feel their presence, an intrusion as sharp and cold as a shard of glass. Dad stood his ground. "This is private property. State your business." I heard Mom's sharp intake of breath from somewhere behind him. The men did not speak. The taller one took a step forward, and I saw the glint of metal in his hand. It was not a rifle. It was something smaller, darker. Things happened quickly then, a blur of motion and muffled sound. There was a scuffle. Dad was strong, a man built of muscle and hard work, but there were two of them. I heard a heavy impact, a grunt of pain that was torn from my father's throat. I saw his large frame stumble, then fall. He landed with a weight that shook the house. Mom screamed. It was not a loud scream, but a choked, terrified sound that was cut off almost as soon as it began. I heard another dull thud. My blood turned to ice, my body went rigid. I could not breathe, could not think. My mind was a white, roaring blank. Then a hand was on my shoulder. It was Mom. I did not know how she had gotten to me. Her face was a pale mask of terror in the gloom, her eyes wide. "Gary," she whispered, her voice trembling so badly I could barely understand her. "Under the bed, now. Do not make a sound, do not move. Do you understand me? No matter what." Her hands pushed me, guided me back into the dark of my room. The command cut through my paralysis. I scrambled on my hands and knees, sliding into the cramped, dusty space beneath my bed. The rough wool of the blanket I had kicked off scratched my cheek. I pulled it around me, pressing myself against the wall, making myself as small as I could. I saw her feet turn and leave the room. From my hiding place, the world was reduced to a narrow strip of floor. I saw the boots, heavy, dark work boots. They moved with a slow, deliberate pace, crossing the living room, their steps echoing on the floorboards. I could hear their low voices, but the words were indistinct, a meaningless rumble. They entered my room. I stopped breathing. The boots stopped near the center of the room, just feet from my hiding place. I could see the worn leather, the mud caked in the treads. My heart was a frantic drum against my ribs, so loud I was sure they could hear it. I pressed my face into the musty blanket, praying for invisibility. I heard a small, whimpering sound from John's bed. He was awake. One pair of boots moved toward his bed. I squeezed my eyes shut, but I could not block out the sound that came next. A soft pop, strangely quiet, followed by a sigh. The sound of a small body settling, becoming still. The boots moved back. I could smell something sharp and acrid in the air, a smell I did not recognize. Then they came for Mom. I heard her pleading, her voice broken. "Not the boys, please, not the boys." The words were a ragged prayer in the suffocating silence. Her voice was extinguished by the same soft, final sound, another heavy fall. The floorboards vibrated beneath my cheek. The two pairs of boots stood in the hallway for what felt like an eternity. They were talking again, the same low murmur. I could not move. Every muscle in my body was locked in terror. My mind was screaming, but no sound came out. I lay in the dust in the dark, a silent witness in my own tomb. Then I heard one of them go back to the living room, to where my father lay. One more soft, definitive sound, a punctuation mark at the end of a sentence. The boots moved toward the front door. I heard the door open, then close. The sound of their footsteps on the porch fading, the groan of a car door, the cough and rumble of an engine coming to life. The sound grew fainter and fainter until it was swallowed by the immense silence of the outback. And then nothing. Only the chirping of the crickets outside, indifferent. The house was still, a profound and terrible stillness that it had never known before. The air was thick with the coppery smell of blood and the sharp tang of gunpowder. I did not move. My mother's last words were an iron command burned into my mind. Do not move, no matter what. I lay under the bed as the moon crawled across the sky. I lay there as the first pale light of dawn began to seep through the curtains. My body ached. I was cold, so cold despite the summer heat. A strange numbness had settled over me, a thick fog that muted the horror. I think I slept or something like it, a shallow state of non-being where fragmented images flashed behind my eyelids. My father's hands, my mother's smile, John's laughing face, the dark shape of the boots. When the sun was fully up, casting bright, unforgiving rectangles of light across the floor, I finally crawled out. The silence was the worst part. The house had always been filled with small sounds. Now there was nothing. I stood in the doorway of my room. John was in his bed, tangled in his sheets. He looked like he was sleeping, except for the dark stain on his pillow and the unnatural stillness of his small chest. I walked into the hallway. My mother was lying there. Her eyes were open, staring at the ceiling with a look of vacant surprise. I did not go into the living room. I could see my father's legs from the hallway. That was enough. I turned and walked out the front door into the blinding sunlight. The dogs were gone. The chickens were clucking in their coop, a sound of absurd normalcy. I did not know what to do. I was an 11-year-old boy on a remote farm, and my world had been unmade. I started walking. I walked down the long, dusty track that led away from the house, not looking back. The sun was hot on my head. The red dust puffed up around my bare feet with each step. I did not cry, there were no tears left. There was only the hollow space inside my chest, and the image of the boots burned into my memory. Faceless men who had walked into my home and turned it into a graveyard. I walked for hours, I think. The landscape was a shimmering, hazy blur. I did not feel thirst or hunger. I just put one foot in front of the other. Eventually, a truck crested the hill, a cloud of dust billowing behind it. It slowed, then stopped. A man I recognized, a neighbor from the next property over, leaned out of the window. His face was etched with concern. He asked me what was wrong, where I was going. I opened my mouth to answer, to tell him what happened, but no words came out. I just stood there in the middle of the road, a ghost child covered in red dust, and pointed back in the direction of the silent farmhouse. I had survived, but I had left my life back there on the floorboards with the people I loved. I was no longer Gary Coffin. I was just what was left. The blacktop ran like a river of ink through an ocean of nothing. Kansas. The word itself felt flat and empty in my mouth. Beside me, Dick drove with a steady hand, a little smirk playing on his lips. He saw a landscape of opportunity, a sure thing, a fat farmer with a safe full of cash. He'd been talking about it for weeks, his words painting a picture of easy money, a clean score that would set us up for good. I just saw the darkness, the endless, suffocating darkness, broken only by the twin beams of the Chevrolet slicing through it. The engine was a low hum, the only sound in the world. I held the shotgun across my lap, its wood smooth and cool against my palms. It felt heavier than it should, weighted with more than just metal and shells. Dick had the map, the plan, the confidence. He had a story from a cellmate, a disgruntled farmhand who'd spun a tale of a rich man who did all his business in cash, who kept $10,000 in a safe in his office, a perfect score. Dick believed it because he wanted to believe it. He was a creature of simple wants and absolute certainty. I was not. I saw 100 ways this could go wrong, 100 cracks in his perfect plan. But I was here anyway, riding shotgun into the heart of the void. The turnoff was just a gravel path, almost invisible. The headlights swept across a white house, neat and quiet, sleeping under a sky full of cold, distant stars. A line of tall trees stood like sentinels along the drive. It looked like a picture from a magazine, a place of peaceful, ordered lives, a life I had never known. The thought soured in my gut. We parked away from the house, behind a clump of buildings that smelled of grain and machinery. The engine died and the silence that rushed in was immense. It was a living thing, that silence. For a long moment we just sat there, two shadows in the front seat. "Ready, honey?" Dick's voice was a low rasp. He called everyone honey. It meant nothing. I just nodded, my throat too tight for words. I pulled the black stockings over my face, the cheap nylon distorting the world into a blurry, suffocating mesh. We got out. The gravel crunched under our boots. The sound was deafening in the stillness. A dog barked once far away, then fell silent. The house was dark except for a single, soft light burning somewhere deep inside. We moved along the wall, our backs scraping against the siding. Every window was a dark, unblinking eye. Dick tried a door, locked. He moved on, a predator testing the edges of its cage. I followed, the shotgun now a cold anchor in my hands. He found it at the side of the house, an office door, he'd said. It was unlocked. He paused, turned to me, and I could see the glint of his eyes through the stocking mask. The smirk was still there. He pushed the door open, a soft sound of wood moving against its frame, and we slipped inside. The air in the house was warm and smelled of baked bread and soap. It was the smell of a home, clean and lived in. We stood in a small office, a desk, a filing cabinet, a telephone, no safe. Dick's flashlight beam danced around the room, a frantic yellow eye searching for the prize. It wasn't there. A flicker of irritation crossed his face, visible even through the mask. He moved out of the office and into the main part of the house. I followed. My heart was a frantic drum against my ribs. This was the moment, the point where everything could still be undone. We could leave, just walk out the way we came. But Dick was already moving down the hall, his steps sure and quiet on the polished floor. He went up the stairs. I waited at the bottom, my knuckles white on the gun. I could hear his soft movements above, the creak of a floorboard. Then a low voice, Dick S. Then another, a man's voice, thick with sleep and confusion. He came back down the stairs, pushing a tall man in pajamas ahead of him. The man, Mr. Clutter, didn't struggle. He just looked from Dick to me, his eyes wide with a kind of resigned disbelief. He was calm, too calm. It was unnerving. "There's no safe," Dick hissed at me, his voice tight with anger. "He says there's no safe." He shoved Mr. Clutter toward a couch in the living room. "Where's the money?" The man shook his head slowly. "I don't keep cash here. I do all my business by check. There's maybe $50 in my wallet." Dick let out a low, frustrated sound. He paced the room, the flashlight beam cutting angry arcs in the dark. The perfect score was crumbling. The $10,000 was a ghost, a fantasy cooked up in a prison cell. I felt a strange sense of relief, mingled with a new kind of dread. If there was no money, what were we doing here? "We have to be sure," Dick said, more to himself than to me. "Wake up the rest of them." That was the line, the one I knew we shouldn't cross. It was one thing to tie up a man and take his wallet. It was another thing entirely to bring his family into it. But the word no was a stone in my throat. I watched as Dick went back up the stairs. He came down with a woman, his wife, a frail figure who seemed to shrink into her nightgown. Then a girl, maybe 16, with dark hair. She didn't cry. She just watched us with dark, serious eyes. And last, a boy, a little younger than the girl, all gangly limbs and bewildered fear. We took them to different rooms. Dick was methodical, his anger replaced by a cold efficiency. He had me help him tie them up. The rope was coarse in my hands. I tied the boy to a mattress frame in his room. I tied the father and the wife in their own rooms. I didn't look at their faces. I focused on the knots, on the pull of the rope, on the simple mechanics of the act. It made it feel less real. Dick took the girl to her room. He spent more time in there. When he came out, his breathing was heavy. We searched the house. We tore it apart, not with violence, but with a quiet, desperate thoroughness. We opened drawers, emptied closets, looked under beds. We found a wallet with less than $50, a silver dollar belonging to the girl, a small portable radio, a pair of binoculars. That was it, the haul from the perfect score. It was a joke. We gathered in the living room again. The house was quiet except for the sound of our own breathing. The family was bound and gagged in their separate rooms, waiting for us to leave. "This is a bust," Dick said, kicking at the leg of a chair. The smirk was gone, replaced by a tight, ugly line, a complete bust. He looked at me. "We can't leave them," he said. His voice was flat. "No witnesses." The words hung in the air of that warm, quiet house. No witnesses. It wasn't a question. It was a statement, a conclusion he had already reached, the final piece of his broken plan clicking into place. My own mind felt like a frozen lake. I thought of the man's calm face, the girl's dark, steady eyes. They weren't people anymore. They were loose ends. That's what Dick saw. That's what he needed me to see. I had killed before in the army, but that was different. That was noise and chaos and distance. This was a quiet house. This was rope and tape. This was looking into someone's eyes. "You take the men," Dick said. He handed me a knife. Its handle was cold and clammy in my sweating palm. "I'll take the women." I didn't move. The shotgun felt like it was fused to my hands. "Come on, Perry," he urged, his voice dropping to a whisper. "We're in this together, all the way." He left me there and went into the father's room. I heard a muffled sound, a struggle that ended quickly. Then nothing. I stood in the hallway, the knife in my hand. The boy was in the basement. I walked down the wooden stairs, each step a lifetime. He was on a mattress in the corner, tied and gagged. He looked at me as I approached. There was no defiance in his eyes, just a question, a deep, silent question that I had no answer for. I raised the knife. Afterward, I went back upstairs. The house was still, utterly still. Dick was waiting for me. He nodded, a sharp, businesslike gesture. We had one more thing to do, the girl, Nancy. We went to her room together. She was tied to her bed. She looked at us, her eyes clear. Dick had the shotgun now. He looked at me, then at her. He hesitated. For the first time all night, Dick hesitated. His certainty had cracked. He couldn't do it. He looked at me, a silent plea in his eyes. He was the big talker, the tough guy, the mastermind, but in the end, he couldn't do it. He handed me the shotgun. I took it. The weight was familiar now. I walked to the side of the bed. I didn't look at her face. I looked at the wall behind her, a pretty blue wall with pictures of horses pinned to it. I raised the gun. The report of the shotgun filled the small room, a physical force that pushed the air out. Then the mother, her room was dark. She was a small shape in the bed. This one was faster, another deafening pulse of sound that was immediately swallowed by the silence of the house. We walked out the front door. We didn't run, we just walked. We got in the car and drove away, back down the long gravel drive past the silent trees. I looked back at the house. It was just a dark shape against a sky that was beginning to pale in the east. No lights came on. No one screamed. It was as if we had never been there at all. We drove for hours. Dick turned on the radio we'd stolen. A cheerful song came on. He started to whistle along. He talked about Mexico, about the money we'd get from pawning the radio and the binoculars. He was already moving on, leaving the white house and its silent occupants behind. I sat there watching the flat, gray landscape of Kansas slide by. I held the empty shotgun shells in my hand. They were still warm. We had gone there for $10,000. We left with less than 50, a radio and a pair of binoculars. And we had left 4 people dead in a quiet house that smelled of soap and baked bread. The sun came up. It painted the horizon in shades of pink and orange. It was beautiful, a brand new day. And I knew with a certainty that chilled me to the bone that I would see every sunrise for the rest of my life through the memory of that night. There was no escape. We had left no witnesses, but I was one. And I would have to live with what I had seen and what I had done in the cold, dark heart of America. The light was the first thing, not a sudden flare, but a thin, inquisitive beam that slid across the ceiling. I was floating in that space between sleep and waking, where a sound from the street can become part of a dream. But the light was inside. It was patient. It crawled over the popcorn texture of the ceiling, down the wall, and touched the edge of the dresser. My eyes were open, but my body was still heavy with sleep. Beside me, Mark breathed deeply, a steady and familiar rhythm that had defined my nights for 3 years. The beam of light paused on his sleeping form, then moved to my face. I didn't flinch. I didn't make a sound. My breath caught somewhere in my throat, a hard little knot of ice. The world had shrunk to the size of that perfect circle of light. He was a shadow detached from the deeper shadows of the room, a shape standing in the doorway to our bedroom. I could not see a face, only a ski mask that swallowed all features. The flashlight was held in a gloved hand. He moved with a quiet economy, no wasted steps. He did not seem agitated or hurried. He seemed to be doing a job. The beam pinned Mark's face. Mark stirred, his breathing changing as he surfaced from sleep. A low whisper cut through the silence. It was sibilant, tense, a voice that was trying to be a whisper but was filled with a grinding anger. He told Mark not to move. He told him he had a gun. He told him what would happen if he made a sound. My own paralysis broke, not into action, but into a deeper, colder awareness. This was real. The stories on the news, the fearful talk among neighbors had walked out of the television and into our bedroom. I felt the rough texture of the sheets against my skin, the slight chill in the air from the open window. Every sense was screaming. The shadow moved to Mark's side of the bed. I saw him produce something from his pocket, shoelaces. He worked quickly, binding Mark's hands behind his back, then his feet. Mark was silent, his body rigid with a tension I had never seen in him. It was the stillness of a trapped animal. Then the light was on me again. The shadow came around the bed. I could smell something on him, a scent of dry earth and stale sweat. He did not speak to me. He simply pulled me from the bed and onto the floor, my nightgown tangling around my legs. He bound my hands with the same practiced efficiency. The laces cut into my wrists. He pushed me face down on the rug. The synthetic fibers scratched my cheek. He left us like that, 2 trussed figures in the dark. His light moved through the house. I could hear the soft opening and closing of drawers in the living room, the clink of silverware in the kitchen. He was not just an intruder, he was an owner. He moved through our home as if he had a right to be there, to touch our things, to know our spaces. The minutes stretched into an eternity. My mind raced, trying to find an escape that did not exist. I cataloged every object in the room, every piece of furniture, as if naming them could keep me anchored to a world that still made sense. The pine dresser we had bought at a flea market, the wedding photo on the nightstand, the life we had built, now just a collection of props for this man's theater. He returned to the bedroom. He was carrying something. He walked over to Mark, and the beam of his light pointed down. He was holding a stack of dishes from our kitchen cabinet, our everyday plates, the blue-rimmed ones we used for dinner. With a calm, deliberate motion, he placed the stack of plates on Mark's back. The whisper came again, this time directly into my ear. His breath was hot and sour. He said if he heard a single plate fall, he would kill us both. It was an act of such bizarre cruelty that it defied understanding. It was not about theft. It was not even about violence in its simplest form. It was about control, about turning our own possessions, our own lives against us. I could hear Mark's breathing, shallow and ragged, as he fought to remain perfectly still beneath the precarious weight. The man then spent time in our closet pulling out my dresses, my blouses. I heard the rustle of fabric. He was looking through my things, my personal, private things. He found my jewelry box. I heard the small metallic sounds as he sorted through it. He took nothing of real value, just small keepsakes, sentimental trinkets. He was not taking them to sell. He was taking a piece of me, a piece of our history. He came back to me. The light was in my eyes, blinding me. I closed them, but the image of it was burned onto the inside of my lids. He used a knife to cut away my nightgown. The cold metal traced a line down my back. It was not a violent slash, but a slow, methodical cut. The sound of the fabric ripping was unnervingly loud in the silent room. What he did next, he did with that same detached, procedural calm. My mind disconnected. I was no longer in my body. I was on the ceiling looking down at a scene that could not be happening. I saw a man and a woman on the floor of a dark room. I saw the quiet, methodical violation. I felt nothing. I was a spectator to my own destruction. The only thing that tethered me to the moment was the sound of Mark's strained breathing, the knowledge that he was alive and holding the weight of our world on his back. He spent hours in the house. He would leave the room and I would think he was gone. The hope was a sharp, painful thing. Then his light would reappear in the doorway and the hope would die. I heard him in the kitchen again. I heard the refrigerator open. He was eating our food, taking a snack in the middle of his work. The whispers continued, a running commentary of threats and taunts. He gritted his teeth as he spoke, a low, constant grinding sound. He seemed to be in a dialogue with himself, a deep well of rage bubbling just beneath the controlled surface. Then, as quietly as he had arrived, he was gone. There was no sound of a door closing, no footsteps on the driveway, just a sudden and complete absence. The silence he left behind was heavier, more terrifying than his presence had been. We lay there in the dark, listening. Was he waiting outside? Was this another game? How much time passed, I do not know. Eventually, Mark spoke my name. His voice was a cracked whisper. He had not moved. The dishes were still on his back. Slowly, painfully, I began to work at the knots on my wrists. My fingers were numb, but I forced them to move. It took a long time. When my hands were finally free, I crawled to Mark. My hands shook so violently I could barely lift the plates. I set them on the floor without a sound. Then I untied him. We did not speak. We held each other on the floor of our violated bedroom, two strangers in a place that was no longer a home. It was a crime scene, a stage. The weeks that followed were a blur of police officers, interviews, and the well-meaning but useless sympathy of friends. They told us we were lucky. We were alive. I would nod, but the words meant nothing. He had not taken our lives, but he had taken our life. The safety of the world was a myth that had been exposed. Every shadow held a figure. Every quiet house held a waiting horror. We moved within a year. We could not stay in that house, but the man came with us. He lived in the space between us, a silent third person in our marriage. The shame and helplessness Mark felt were a wall I could not climb. The memory of the violation was a landscape I could not escape. Years passed. The attacks continued, spreading across the state. The papers gave him names: the East Area Rapist, the original Night Stalker. Each new story was a fresh wound. I would read the accounts of other women, other couples, and I would see my own bedroom, hear my own terrified breathing. He was a ghost haunting an entire generation of Californians. Then the rape stopped, but the murders began. The ghost had become a killer. And then nothing. The years turned into decades. The story faded from the front pages, becoming a cold case, a legend. Mark and I divorced. The crack that the man had put in our foundation finally split the house apart. I grew older. I built a new life, a fortress of solitude with deadbolts and alarms. But every night when I turned out the lights, I checked the doorway to my bedroom. One afternoon, more than 40 years after that night, my phone rang. It was a detective from Sacramento County, a name I had not heard in years. He told me he had news. My hand tightened on the receiver. "We found him," the detective said. His voice was calm, matter of fact. "We have him in custody. His name is Joseph James DeAngelo." The name meant nothing, just a string of syllables. "He was a police officer in the 70s, the detective continued, in Auburn and Exeter." I sat down. A police officer. The quiet efficiency, the knowledge of our routines, the methodical control, it all clicked into place with a sickening finality. The protector had been the predator. The detective said they had used a new type of DNA technology, tracing his family tree through genealogy websites. Science had finally caught the ghost. After I hung up, I sat in silence for a long time. There was no elation, no sense of victory, just a profound and hollow quiet. I looked out the window at my quiet suburban street. The world looked the same as it had a moment before, but the ghost was gone. He was no longer a faceless shadow in every dark corner. He was just a man, an old man who had once been a cop, an old man who had eaten food from my refrigerator while my world fell apart, an old man who would now die in a cage. The fear, a constant companion for a lifetime, finally began to recede, leaving behind not peace but a vast and barren emptiness.